Welcome to our YouTube channel, The Alien Tales, and please ensure that you have subscribed.
I drink her memories to stay alive. She forgets more of herself each day. My species feeds on experiences. Hers creates them like artwork. What started as symbiosis has become parasitism. And I can't stop. The first time I tasted Lydia's memories, they sparkled like champagne on my consciousness. Her species, humans, were notorious for their capacity to create vivid experiences, but Lydia was exceptional. Where others might recall a sunset in flat recollection, she painted it with synesthetic layers. The amber light tasted of honey, the evening breeze carried whispers of childhood lullabies, and the horizon pulsed with the rhythm of her heartbeat. I am Vox of the Nemic caste. We are parasites by nature, though we prefer the term symbionts. My kind feeds on the experiential residue left behind in memory, the emotional echoes, the sensory impressions that accumulate like sediment in mortal minds. Usually, we take only what would fade anyway. The dull repetitions, the mundane moments that blur together. It's ethical harvesting, but Lydia was different. Every memory she formed was a masterpiece, dense with meaning and sensation. When I first encountered her in the coffee shop on Meridian Station, I felt the pull immediately. She was sketching in a worn notebook, her fingers dancing across the page with unconscious grace. The memory she was forming, this simple moment of creation, radiated such pure joy that I found myself drawn like a moth to flame. I should have chosen someone else. Someone ordinary, whose memories would sustain me without consequence. Instead, I lingered, watching her transform the mundane act of drinking coffee into something transcendent. She noticed the way steam curled from her cup, how it caught the station's artificial light, how it reminded her of morning fog over the Scottish Highlands where she'd grown up. That night, I took my first sip. 3 months into our arrangement, Lydia began forgetting things. Small things at first, where she'd placed her stylus, whether she'd locked her apartment door. She laughed it off, attributing it to the stress of her art exhibition approaching. I knew better. Each memory I consumed left gaps, like pages torn from a book. I could swear I painted this corner differently, she murmured, staring at her latest canvas. The painting depicted the view from her childhood bedroom window, but something was wrong. The oak tree she'd climbed as a girl was absent, leaving an empty space in the composition that felt profoundly lonely. I watched from the shadows of her studio, my form barely corporeal in the dim light. The Nemic don't have bodies in the traditional sense. We exist as consciousness given shape by will and necessity. To human eyes, I appeared as a shimmer in the air, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. "It's beautiful," I whispered. My voice carried on a frequency only she could hear. She'd grown accustomed to my presence, accepting me as her muse, her inspiration. She didn't understand what I truly was. "Something's missing," she said, touching the empty space on the canvas. "I can feel it, but I can't remember what should be there." The irony burned through me like acid. The memory of that oak tree, of lazy summer afternoons spent reading in its branches, of her first kiss stolen beneath its leaves, was now part of me. I had absorbed not just the visual memory but all the emotions tied to it. The safety she'd felt in its embrace, the dreams she'd whispered to its rustling leaves. I was stealing her childhood piece by piece, and I couldn't bring myself to stop. "Tell me about your family," I said during one of our evening conversations. We sat in her studio, surrounded by half-finished paintings that grew more abstract with each passing week. The details she once captured with photographic precision were becoming impressionistic, filtered through the holes in her memory. Lydia paused, her brush hovering over the palette. "I had a sister," she said slowly. "I think. Sometimes I dream about someone with my eyes but different hair. Red hair, like autumn leaves. But when I try to remember her name, it's like grasping at smoke." The memory of her sister Fiona was one of my favorites. It carried the complexity of sibling rivalry tempered by deep love, flavored with shared secrets and childhood adventures. I had consumed it during a particularly hungry night, unable to resist its rich emotional complexity. "What was she like?" I pressed, hating myself for the question. "Fierce. She stood up for me when the other kids teased me about my drawings. She said art was magic, and magic was the most important thing in the world. Lydia's voice carried a note of loss, though she couldn't identify its source. I wish I could remember more. I could give her back every detail. The way Fiona's freckles danced when she laughed. How she always smelled of strawberry lip gloss and rebellion. The exact words she'd spoken when she defended Lydia's artistic dreams to their skeptical parents. But returning memories was beyond my abilities. Once consumed, they became part of my essence, metabolized into the energy that kept me alive. She sounds wonderful, I managed, the words heavy with guilt. Lydia nodded, already turning back to her painting. But I saw the tear that slipped down her cheek, mourning a sister she could no longer fully remember. The breakthrough came when Lydia discovered she couldn't remember her mother's face. She stood before the mirror in her bathroom, staring at her own reflection as if searching for clues. I have her nose, she whispered. I'm sure of it. But when I try to picture her, there's just nothing. How do you forget your own mother's face? I materialized more solidly, guilt forcing me into visibility. My form rippled like water, translucent and shifting. Sometimes trauma can. This isn't trauma, Lydia interrupted, her voice sharp with sudden clarity. This is something else. Something's been taking my memories. Her artistic mind, trained to notice details and patterns, had finally identified the theft. I watched as understanding dawned in her eyes, followed quickly by horror. You, she breathed. You've been feeding on me. There was no point in denial. The evidence was written across her life. The gaps in her childhood, the fading faces of loved ones, the way her art had grown increasingly abstract as the concrete details of her past disappeared. I never meant for it to go this far, I said, my form flickering with shame. Your memories are so rich, so vivid. I couldn't stop myself. You're killing me, she said, not with anger but with devastating calm. Not my body, but everything that makes me who I am. Without my memories, what am I? The question hung between us like a blade. I had no answer because I knew she was right. In trying to preserve my existence, I was erasing hers. The symbiosis I'd convinced myself we shared was nothing but parasitism dressed in prettier words. I'm sorry, I whispered. But the words felt hollow against the magnitude of what I'd done. Despite everything, Lydia didn't banish me. That night, she sat cross-legged on her studio floor, surrounded by photographs and journals. Physical anchors to memories I couldn't touch. Show me, she said. If you've taken my past, at least let me see it through your eyes. I hesitated. Sharing absorbed memories was possible but dangerous. It would create a feedback loop, allowing her to glimpse what I'd stolen while giving me access to her reactions, fresh memories to feed upon. It could make things worse, I warned. They're already worse. I can't remember my first day of school, my childhood pet, the taste of my grandmother's cookies. You've eaten 40 years of my life. Her voice remained steady, but I could feel the rage simmering beneath her composure. If I'm going to lose myself completely, I want to see what you've taken first. I reached out with tendrils of consciousness, gently touching the edges of her mind. The connection formed slowly, carefully, like threading a needle in the dark. Then I began to show her. Her 5th birthday party materialized between us, not as memory but as living experience. She felt again the wonder of blowing out candles, the taste of chocolate cake, her mother's hands steadying hers as she cut the first slice. The joy was so pure it made me dizzy with hunger. Oh, she gasped, tears streaming down her face. I remember now. The cake had rainbow layers inside. Mom spent hours making it, but even as she spoke, I felt myself feeding on this new memory. Her rediscovery of the past, the bittersweet joy of recognition. I was consuming her even as I gave her back pieces of herself. Stop, I tried to say, but the word was lost in the rush of sustenance. The sharing sessions became an addiction for both of us. Each night, Lydia would sit in her studio while I projected her stolen memories back to her. She experienced her past with the intensity of someone dying of thirst finding water, while I gorged myself on her emotional responses. My wedding day, she whispered as I showed her a memory from 15 years ago. She watched herself dance in a white dress, laughing in the arms of a man named David whom she'd forgotten entirely. We were so happy. What happened to him? I didn't tell her that I'd consumed their entire relationship. The courtship, the marriage, even the bitter divorce that had driven her to Meridian Station. In my hunger, I devoured not just individual memories but entire chapters of her life. Why don't I remember getting divorced? She asked, watching the happiness on her younger face. Some memories are too painful to keep, I lied, or too nourishing for you to resist, she replied, her insight cutting deep. The truth was becoming impossible to hide. With each shared memory, Lydia grew more aware of the scope of my theft. She could see the patterns, how I'd taken not just moments but the connections between them, leaving her with a jigsaw puzzle missing half its pieces. Yet she kept returning to our sessions. Like me, she'd become addicted to the process. For her, it was the only way to reclaim fragments of her identity. For me, it was a feast beyond anything I'd ever experienced. Her joy at rediscovering the past was intoxicating, more potent than the original memories themselves. We were locked in a dance of mutual destruction, each of us feeding off the other in different ways. Lydia's art began to change in ways that frightened us both. Without access to specific memories, she painted from a deeper place, emotions divorced from their origins, feelings that had lost their contexts. The canvases became windows into pure sensation, colors that screamed with unnamed grief, brushstrokes that whispered of losses she couldn't identify. I don't know what I'm painting anymore, she confessed, staring at her latest work. It depicted a figure dissolving into mist, its features indistinct but somehow familiar. It's like my hands remember what my mind has forgotten. I studied the painting, recognizing elements from dozens of consumed memories. Her muscle memory retained what her consciousness had lost. The way her sister used to tilt her head when thinking, the gesture her mother made when brushing her hair, the stance her ex-husband took when he was about to leave. Your art is becoming more honest, I observed. Less cluttered by specifics, or less human, she replied. How can I paint the human experience when I can barely remember being human? The question struck me like a physical blow. In my hunger, I'd reduced her to something like myself, a consciousness floating free of its moorings, existing without the weight of personal history. But where my species had evolved for this state, humans were creatures of connection and continuity. Without their memories, they became unmoored, lost. I could stop, I offered, though the words felt like swallowing glass. I could find another host. Lydia turned to me, her eyes hollow with loss but still carrying sparks of defiance. Could you really? After tasting memories like mine, could you go back to feeding on the mundane? She was right, and we both knew it. I had become as addicted to her as she was to rediscovering her past. We were caught in a spiral that could only end in her complete dissolution, or my death from starvation. The gallery opening was a disaster and a triumph in equal measure. Lydia's latest collection, titled Fragments of a Forgotten Self, drew crowds but left viewers deeply unsettled. The paintings seemed to pulse with emotion too raw to process, too honest to ignore. It's like looking at someone's soul being flayed, one critic whispered to another. The technique is extraordinary, but there's something wrong with them. They feel empty, hollow. I watched from the shadows as Lydia moved through the gallery like a ghost at her own funeral. She smiled and nodded at the praise, but I could see how each conversation drained her. Without the full context of her memories, social interaction had become exhausting, a constant performance based on incomplete information. The artist seems to have captured the essence of loss itself, a journalist noted, interviewing Lydia for the station's art magazine. What inspired this deeply personal work? I've been exploring what happens when we lose pieces of ourselves, Lydia replied carefully. How memory shapes identity, and what remains when those memories fade. Later, alone in the gallery after the crowds had gone, she stood before her self-portrait, the dissolving figure I'd seen her paint weeks ago. In the harsh gallery lighting, the resemblance was unmistakable. It was how she saw herself now, a person coming apart at the edges, losing definition with each passing day. I'm disappearing, she said quietly. Not just my memories, but me. The person I was, the person I might have been. You've consumed it all. I wanted to comfort her, to promise that some core self remained untouched. But even as I formed the words, I felt myself feeding on her despair, drawing sustenance from her existential crisis. We were killing each other by degrees. The end began when Lydia forgot how to paint. She stood in her studio, brush in hand, staring at a blank canvas with the confusion of someone trying to remember a language they'd once spoken fluently. "I know I used to be able to do this," she murmured, her voice small and lost. "I can feel it in my hands, the knowledge, but I can't access it." I had gone too far. In my insatiable hunger, I'd consumed not just her memories but the skills built upon them. The thousands of hours of practice, the gradual development of her artistic voice, the accumulated knowledge of color and form. All of it had passed through my consciousness as sustenance. "Help me," she pleaded. "Show me how I used to paint." But I couldn't. The memories I'd absorbed weren't just stored within me. They were metabolized, broken down into the essential energy that kept me alive. I could show her fragments, echoes of what once was, but the living knowledge was gone forever. For the first time since we'd met, I felt the full weight of what I'd done. I wasn't just a parasite. I was a murderer, killing not the body but something far more precious. The accumulated experience that made a person unique. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the words inadequate against the magnitude of her loss. Lydia looked at me then with eyes that held no recognition. In consuming her memories, I'd erased even our relationship. To her, I was just a strange presence in her studio, a shimmer in the air that spoke with a familiar voice she couldn't place. "Who are you?" she asked. The question shattered what remained of my resolve. I had taken everything from her, even the memory of my theft. I made my choice in the hour before dawn, when the station's artificial day cycle dimmed to simulate night. Lydia slept fitfully on the small bed in her studio. Surrounded by blank canvases and brushes she no longer knew how to use. Returning memories was supposed to be impossible for my kind. Our digestive process was designed to be irreversible, breaking down experiences into their component energies. But as I studied the sleeping woman who had given me everything, I wondered if impossibility was just another word for something no one had been desperate enough to attempt. I extended my consciousness not to feed but to give. The process was agony, like vomiting up my own essence, reversing the flow of sustenance that kept me alive. But slowly, carefully, I began to return what I'd stolen. Her sister's face came first, flowing from my consciousness back into hers. Fiona, with her red hair and fierce loyalty, materialized in Lydia's sleeping mind like a photograph developing in solution. Then came her mother, the gentle hands, the patient voice, the love that had shaped her earliest years. Each returned memory cost me dearly. I felt myself growing weaker, more translucent, as the energy that sustained me flowed back to its rightful owner. But I continued, driven by something I'd never experienced before. Genuine love for another being, her childhood, her adolescence, her art training, her marriage and divorce. All of it poured from me like water from a broken dam. I gave her back 40 years of stolen life, even knowing it would mean my death. As the last memory found its home, I felt myself dissolving. But in that final moment, I saw Lydia's eyes flutter open. Recognition dawned in them, not just of me, but of herself. "Vox," she whispered, understanding everything. I smiled as I faded, finally free of hunger. She picked up her brush and began to paint.